Fred Wooden, and I'm holding my iPad backwards because while it was turned off, it went the other way. But good morning, Valley Unitarian Universalist community. I'm Fred Wooden, your interim minister, called Reverend only to the extent that I am reverent, and sometimes doctor, but only to the extent that I heal, announcing that this awkward moment is the part of an hour set aside for the quixotic journey of faith. James Baldwin never fails to prod me. He once said, if the concept of God has any validity or use, it can only be to make us larger, freer, and more loving. For that concept, that idea, that hope, this community exists. Each week, we take another step toward that hope. Stumbling though it might be, we fall forward into hope. And now my partner in ministry, Marcy Bodwin, would like to share something that would be good for everyone of every age. Marcy?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Marcy Bodwin, the Director of Faith Formation here at Valley Unitarian Universalist Congregation. So this is our time for our Time for All Ages, a time when any families want to bring children close to the screen. But today I want to invite everyone to make sure that you can see and hear the screen because the Time for All Ages is a little special. So while the kids are getting organized, I just want to bring to your attention a couple of announcements. First of all, faith formation classes will be taking place today, but not next Sunday, October 4th. It's fall break, and we want to make sure that the kids get a full week off of all those Zoom and Google Classroom online meetings. So we'll take a week off for that. But also, anyone over the age of 18, please don't forget to get registered to vote in Arizona. If you're not sure whether or not you're registered, you can go to vote.org and it will verify for you. After the worship today, you'll be invited to join a breakout room. And our thought-provoking question today is, are spiritual practices part of your life as a Unitarian Universalist? So let's get ready for our Time for All Ages. We want to thank everyone, the children and the adults who participated in our Pebble In Gathering this week. I created a short movie of our gathering. It's one of the many ways that we tell our story together. The accompanying music is Coming Together by Faith Rivera.
We're rolling.
One heart, one mind. Awesome video, Marcy. As is the tradition, if you could, please draw your chalice or candle near and join me in reciting the words that we use to light our chalice. We kindle this flame, symbol of our faith, for the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of love, which calls us to work for justice. Good morning. My name is Dave Jude, and it is my pleasure to serve as your worship associate for this morning's Zoom service. Valley Unitarian Universalist Congregation is an active, loving family, and everyone is welcome. Whoever you are, however you define yourself, whoever you choose to love, wherever you are on your spiritual journey, and whether you are a VUU member, regular attendee, or visiting us for the first or second time, you are welcome here. Last week, we were thrilled to welcome the Reverend Fred Wooden to the pulpit for the first time as he officially took over as interim minister here at VUU. While it was uplifting to see him preach from inside the sanctuary last Sunday, this morning Reverend Fred is joining us from his other home in the great state of Michigan, where he'll be delivering today's sermon, Getting Wet Feet and Other Spiritual Practices. When I first saw this title and read Fred's description, I immediately thought of the 2019 vacation to Hawaii that my wife and I took to celebrate our 25th wedding anniversary. I have referenced this trip before, and yes, that is the same vacation that Teresa broke her ankle on. But that was on day 3. One day earlier, I jumped off a waterfall. Of course, and yes, that is me, with a little arrow and everything else. Of course, I posted the video and this pic to Facebook, leading my mom to ask the obvious question, why did you decide to do it? I have never been a daredevil in the true sense. Heights don't really bother me unless I'm on one of those extendable lean against a building ladder. I had no problem walking out on the clear glass floor of the Sears Tower Observatory in Chicago. I know it's Willis Tower now, but for native Chicagoans, it will always be Sears Tower. Jumping off a waterfall, perhaps I saw it as another way to step outside my own personal comfort zone. I admit, I like seeing the reaction of my new students every year when they find out I have 12 tattoos. And if we're connected on social media, you know that back in July, I shaved my head for the second straight summer when in just 2.5 months, Team Lupus Blows, Teresa Knows raised another $10,000 for the Lupus Foundation of America. On day 2 of our Maui trip, Teresa and I were driven by our local guide, Sammy, the entire stretch of the amazing road to Hana, and then continued all the way around the east side of the island. Sammy had asked us early on during our excursion if we'd like to stop and swim at a waterfall. We had both said yes, we would love to do that, although Teresa was a bit weary of how cold the water would be. Her lupus combined with Raynaud syndrome makes very cold water or environments extremely painful. Teresa's concern was legit. The water was cold. We followed Sammy to a spot that was slightly downstream from the waterfall and the natural pool so that we could cross to the other side of the stream, find a dry place to stash our belongings, and as it turns out, the trail to the top of the waterfall was also only accessible from that side of the stream. We were watching folks jump off the top of the waterfall since we had first arrived. And while part of me was envious, the overly cautious angel that was sitting on my shoulder was telling me there was no way I would be doing that myself. However, after following Sammy across the shallow stream and toward the waterfall pool, Sammy turned to us and stated nonchalantly, "Well, I'm going up." Suddenly, I found myself handing my waterproof camera that I had purchased for our 20th anniversary trip to the Caribbean to Teresa and telling Sammy, "Wait, I'm going with you." The hike to the top of the waterfall was pretty easy, almost too easy. When we got to the top, it was just Sammy and me. She said she'd go first and that I should watch and just do exactly what she did. Her advice was to wait for her to clear below, slide out to the middle, stand up, and just go. She told me not even to count to 3 for fear that I might psych myself out. Just take the leap of faith. And then Sammy was gone, disappearing over the waterfall and plunging into the deep pool below. And then it was my turn. Without hesitation, I did as Sammy had done. I slid out to the middle and I carefully stood up. And in that split second before I jumped, I felt a flood of emotions, fear and anxiety, which caused a very distinct knot in my stomach, along with a rush of adrenaline. and I listened to Sammy. I didn't count to 3. I just took the leap. It turns out I was higher up than what my brain had originally calculated. I was plunging toward the pool longer than expected. And when I did hit the water, I found the pool to be deeper than expected. I remember my foot eventually finding the bottom before I started my trek back to the surface. And just when I began to wonder when I would reach the surface, it came into view. When I finally came up for air, I actually had trouble catching my breath. Sammy had swam over to make sure that I had surfaced okay, and despite the cold water, Teresa had joined her in the pool. The combination of the water temperature combined with the force of hitting the water at a high velocity was enough of a shock to knock the wind out of me. Eventually, my breathing settled, and Sammy took the camera from Teresa and took a picture of the two of us together behind the waterfall. The rest of the day, I was on cloud 9. I felt a grand sense of accomplishment. I had jumped off a freaking waterfall, and I had done so unscathed, which only made me feel worse the next day when Teresa broke her ankle on what should have been an innocent slip and fall on a dirt path leading down to the blowhole lookout on the west side of Maui. Because of Teresa's injury, we were supposed to go back to Maui this summer. It was supposed to be our Maui redo trip, which obviously didn't happen because of COVID-19. But memories of that day on the road to Hana and that experience got me through the summer. Every time I ran and jumped into our swimming pool, I imagined myself taking that leap off the top of the waterfall. And just for an instant, would feel that same adrenaline rush and a tiny flutter of butterflies in my stomach. Was jumping off the waterfall in Hawaii a spiritual experience for me? While I didn't think it was at the time, as I reflect on it after the fact, maybe it was. It showed me that I had an inner courage to continue to step outside of my comfort zone that I didn't know existed. I didn't have the choice to dip my toe in the water, so to speak. It was one of those go big or go home moments that I'll remember for the rest of my life. So as we gather this morning together in Zoom land, think of that take a leap of faith moment in your life and reflect fondly upon it. Maybe in the moment you didn't think it qualified as spiritual, but perhaps later you realized that it was. My only regret that day is that the water wasn't just a tad bit warmer. Once again, welcome to VUU, and let's worship together. We continue now with our first and very appropriate hymn, sung by Sweet Honey in the Rocks. Here is Wade in the Water.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water, when God's gonna trouble the water. Come on and wade in the water, you gotta wade. All dressed up in white, God's gonna trouble the water. You know they must be the children of the Israelites. God's gonna trouble the water. Well, now you wanna wade in the water. See those children dressed in black. God's gonna trouble the water. You know, they come a long way, ain't turning back. No, no, no.
See the children, they're dressed up in blue. You know my God's gonna
gonna trouble the water. I see it looks like my people, they're coming on through. Well, my God's gonna trouble the water.
Well, everybody just wait, wait and wait on trouble the water. See those children dressed in red. My God, He's gonna trouble the water. You know it must be the children that Moses led. My God, He's gonna trouble the water.
Children all dressed in green. God's gonna trouble the water. You know they're moving down to that Jordan stream. Well, God's gonna trouble the water. Come on, down in the water, my children.
Some say Paul, my God, my God. Well, you know there ain't but one God made us all. God's gonna trouble the water. Everybody ought to just wait on the water. Wait in the water.
It's time, I think, for us to think differently about giving to VUU. Sometimes we think of trouble as being a bad thing, but if the song is right and if John Lewis is right, there is good trouble. And this church, this community, this spiritual gathering, whatever we wish to call it, is the place where we learn how to get into the good trouble of disturbing what needs to be changed. We may not know exactly what that is on a day-to-day basis, which is why we gather each week. But I need you to think about sustaining this community in a way that arouses you and others to trouble the waters that are holding back truth and love and justice. Last week, I shared words from W.E.B. Du Bois. Now is the accepted time, not tomorrow, not some more convenient season. It is today that our best work can be done and not some future day and future year. Please nourish this community today, for today truly is when our best work can be done. Now, when we and all are hungry and thirsty for truth and love and justice. And now, some wonderful music to help trouble our souls.
Yes, let's take this moment to center ourselves. And you can use this hymn to really ground ourselves. I love the quote by Hans Margolius that says, "Only in quiet waters things mirror themselves undistorted. Only in a quiet mind is adequate perception of the world." Close our eyes, take a deep breath, and let's join together singing "Winds Be Still."
Winds be still, storm clouds pass in silence come, peace grace this time with harmony. Fly, bird of hope, and shine, light of love, and in calm let all find tranquility. Bird, fly high, lift our gaze toward distant view, help us to sense life's mystery. Fly high and far and lead us each to see how we move through the winds of eternity. Take a breath. Let this song be a prayer, a meditation, sending peace and love to all. Light shine in, illuminate our inward view, help us to see with clarity. Shine bright and true so we may join our songs in new sounds that become full symphonies. Winds be still, storm clouds pass and silence come, peace grace this time with harmony. Fly, bird of hope, and shine, light of love, and in calm let all find tranquility.
A time of prayer, a time of meditation. And I think of the words we just sang, full symphony, harmony. And I think that's why we come into a community like this, to find those things. But what do they mean? Let's dig a little deeper. It means symphony, to bring voices together. I'll bet you have some voices in your head every day. A chore to do, a task that must be done, a worry that keeps nagging at you, a hope, a fear. And these pull us apart. We hoped to bring our voices together, and that's what spirituality is about, bringing the voices together, the voices within us and the voices we share between us. It is said there are really only 3 prayers, and I think there are really 4. I think Anne Lamott said there are only 3: help, thanks, and wow. I'd like to add oops, because making mistakes is part of the show too. But I want to focus a little on the thanks part for the moment. Because in our hymn book, there is a text that says, give thanks for the past, for those who had vision, who planted and watered so dreams could come true. Give thanks for the now, for study, for worship, for mission that bids us turn prayer into deed. So I ask you to pause just a moment and say, what is your heart longing for today? Can it move you toward a deed? And I want you to give thanks for that voice. I want you to give thanks for that voice that longs for something that you need, to pull all the other voices toward it. Perhaps it is a job, for health, for love, for hope. However small it may seem to you, it is where you need to be. So let's bring to full symphony those voices and give thanks for that voice that leads you into tomorrow. And so we pause. And as we pause, I'll mention that the music you're about to hear was created by the choir and music department of a church I served back in the 1990s and early 2000s. And I am grateful to that community that they have given us a gift that I can share with you. And I think you're really going to enjoy what they have to offer.
Bring me a little water, Sylvie. Bring me a little water now. Bring me a little water, Sylvie. Every little once in a while. Bring it in a bucket, Sylvie. Bring it in a bucket now. Bring it in a bucket, Sylvie. Every little once in a while. Sylvie, come running, bucket in her hand. She will bring a little water fast as she can. Bring me a little water, Sylvie. Bring me a little water now. Bring me a little water, Sylvie. Every little once in a while.
Can't you see me coming? Can't you see me now? I will bring a little water.
Every little once in a while. Won't you bring me a little water, Sylvie? Bring me a little water now. Bring me a little water, Sylvie. Every little once in a while. Once in a while, won't you bring me a little water, Sylvie? Bring me a little water now. Bring me a little water, Sylvie. Every little once in a while. Every little once in a while, yeah. Every little once in a while. Ooh, bring me a little. Every little once in a while.
Yes. Whoa, was that fun or what? And I'm so proud of my former church. They are doing great work. But I'm really glad that you can take part in it too, because that's the communion part. It isn't the water, although that would be lovely. And it isn't the music, it is the coming together. And this time a community you don't know, that you now know through me as part of your community, communion, community, same thing. Now, I'm not really into my sermon yet, but I will get there. But I want you to notice that connection that wasn't there before, and it really is there. I also want you to notice that we didn't do water communion, we did a stone communion, pebbles gathering together. Well, that's not quite as fluid as all the waters. Hey, we live in Arizona. We got to hang on to our water. But the point was, we did use the pebbles as a way of bringing ourselves together. And by the way, if you want to drop one off at the office sometime, just call ahead. We can collect yours too. And we're going to keep them. We're going to keep them together as a reminder that even though we are physically separated, we are together as a community, even when we don't see each other. And you'll see other music by other congregations. I have a couple of great ones that Katie and I have isolated from other communities in our community of Unitarian Universalists and even beyond. And I do want to mention that when you saw Sweet Honey in the Rock, the older woman with the gray hair in the middle is a Unitarian Universalist who comes from All Souls Church in Washington, D.C., which is my old stomping grounds as a kid. So you thought you didn't know me, but here I am. I'm right in the middle of you already. So let me talk about what I want to talk about today, and that is about getting wet feet and spiritual practices. That's just a kind of a lead in. I want to start with casting blame. I'm going to blame it on National Geographic. And Deanne understands why that's tricky, because her dad was a photographer for National Geo. I was reading a copy of it about 10 years ago, an article about Hadrian's Wall, which is up in northern England, very near to where the current border between Scotland and England is. And the Romans built that in the 3rd century to keep the barbarians to the north, what they call the Picts, away from marauding into their Roman England. And there were pictures, any great pictures. And at the end of the article, there was a sidebar about how there is a path. People can walk from one side of the country to the other along the wall. And at that moment, I knew I just had to do that. You know, those moments are rare when you know with absolute clarity what you need to do. Neither of the most important decisions in my life were that clear. Never once did I feel like super called to the quote ministry, like I heard a voice or anything. I kind of felt my way into it, and it kind of happened. So I didn't have that moment of clarity. It just sort of turned up as I was in seminary, wondering if I should be one. And even when I proposed to my wife, and that was like 48 years ago, I was a little nervous, not because I thought she wouldn't say yes, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to say yes to a lifelong commitment. But that was 48 years ago, and here I am, both a clergy person and a husband. But this was different, this thing that happened 10 years ago. I absolutely knew I was going to do this. And a few months later, there I was standing on the remains of an old Roman fort in the town of Wall's End. That's why they call it Wall's End, because that's where the wall ended, right on the banks of the River Tyne. And the River Tyne opens out into the North Sea. And before me, as I faced west, was about 90 miles of path and trail that would end with a view of the Irish Sea. The September weather was spectacular, and I rarely have felt so calm, so sure, so present to myself and the world. Back in seminary, when I was wondering if I were going to be a clergyman, and I'll tell you why I use clergyman rather than minister another time. We studied and met a scholar named James Luther Adams. He was an ethicist among the Unitarian Universalists who, well, when he was a student in Germany, he was arrested by the Gestapo and only got out a little bit before they were trying to get him a second time. He met Paul Tillich, the great Protestant theologian, and introduced him to America in many ways. And he taught scores, if not hundreds, of all Unitarian Universalist clergy. And because of his work, we talk about things like covenants, and the one you have that you recite when you light your chalice, the one that you clergy have with each other, and the UUA itself has a kind of covenant of what we are, the 7 principles that bind us together. He really was the foremost mind among Unitarian Universalist scholars in the middle to late 20th century. And his words appear in our gray hymn book. And I thought of them because he wrote them as a compliment to an older ancestor, William Ellery Channing, who wrote something we may have recited in the past called, "I call that mind free." And he lists a number of reasons why we call that mind free. Well, he wrote one that begins, "I call that church free." He used the term church. And the reason I think about it is that it ends this way. It is a pilgrim church, servant church on an adventure of the Spirit. I remember that because I was told a story when I was in seminary that echoed this about a rock-ribbed Protestant coming up to a good Universalist saying, "Where do you stand?" And the Universalist said, "We don't stand anywhere, we move." And that describes kind of who we are. We are a pilgrim movement, a pilgrim community. And that means I am a pilgrim. And I think that's why I responded so deeply to that lure of crossing England by foot. We hear a lot about spiritual practices these days. Maybe you go to yoga class. Perhaps you practice mindfulness or vipassana meditation. Perhaps you are in a book group. Some people study some in a way that's called Lectio Divina. Perhaps you walk the labyrinth. Maybe you keep some kind of regular daily discipline. Most of them, though, are not new. They're really very old because we discovered all the ways to cultivate the Spirit thousands of years ago. My spiritual discipline is pilgrimage. That's what I discovered, that I need to do that to be whole. And it's really old too. If you read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, you know they go back to the 1300s, and it's the story of pilgrims going to Canterbury from London. And I replicated that journey. I started at the Tabard Inn, now the George, and I walked all the way from London down to Canterbury, not because I knew the tales so much as I wanted to put that ground underneath my feet. But that was the bookend because I went across England in 2012. That was Hadrian's Wall. I went across it. I made that pilgrimage in 2017. And in between, I walked a Buddhist path in rural Japan. I went down a shorter version of the Camino de Santiago. And I climbed a sacred mountain in China, Taishan. I crossed the Inca Trail up over Warmi-Wanyuska Pass, up to 14,000 feet. I gotta tell you, that was tough. And I paid my respects in other ways to places like Varanasi, where Hindus come to die and be cremated and pour their ashes into the Ganges, and to Bodh Gaya in India, where the Buddha reached enlightenment. Were it not for COVID-19, I would have retired from my church here in Grand Rapids and started on the Via Francigena, a 900-mile path from Canterbury to Rome. Oh, well, that'll have to wait for another day. But I want to tell you that I not only do that, I learn from that spiritual practice, which is the whole point. And there are some lessons I've learned that will be helpful to us as we go on our pilgrimage, the interim journey. So I'm going to go back to that first pilgrimage where I got wet feet and tell you what I learned that I think we can use in the year or two ahead. One of the things I learned was that I hate being lost. Late one afternoon, I was really tired, foot weary from climbing up and down hills, and it was raining off and on. It's England after all, and it's green for a reason. They have lots of rain. I was sure I was lost. I had no idea which way to go. Well, I learned something years ago, that when you're lost, back up to a place where you know you weren't lost. So I retraced my steps back to where I thought I knew I was, and I looked at my guidebook and I looked around, and I was in the right place. But I still did not know where to go. And that's when the panic began to set in. And I began to feel a little helpless and worried, scared. So I flagged down a driver on a nearby road, feeling very sheepish and kind of ashamed, and asked if he knew the way to the inn I was supposed to spend the night. And he said, "Oh, it's just over the next hill. Hop in, I'll drive you." Well, it turns out I was on the right path. I just hadn't gone far enough. And the next hill, though, was more than a hill. It was 2 or 3 or 4. And I would have gone a lot further before I would have seen my destination. First lesson: when you feel lost, figure out if you really are. If we are a pilgrim people, a pilgrim church, as Adams calls it, we're going to feel lost now and then, or at least a little bewildered. And that's a reference to when Daniel Boone was once asked if he had ever been lost out there in the great woods. He said, "No, I've never been lost, but I was bewildered once for about 3 days." Bewildering is an interesting word because it is easy to get turned around, even when you're in the right place. How do you know you're in the right place? Notice that the word bewildered has inside of it the word wild. In ancient times, wild places were where 6 holy people would go. The children of Israel, you heard reference to them with the wade in the water. They encountered God, as the story says, in the wilderness. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and yet that was a journey they had to take. Jesus, when he got baptized, according to the story, was taken into the wilderness for 40 days. People of all faiths have gone off into wild places, deserted places, deserts like Arizona, to find where their spirit was prompting them to go. The time between settled ministers is a bit of a wilderness. It's a bit wild. It's a bit deserted. You would be very well forgiven if you felt a little abandoned and a little bit unsure. It is very tempting when you're in the wilderness, after all, to try to go back to the familiar. I'm sure some people are saying, well, shouldn't we go back to doing this? Or shouldn't we go back to being that kind of? That's a very real temptation, and I honor it. But we all know that there's no going back. There's only going forth. I could also at this point observe that that same feeling seems to be in our very nation right now. We've been trying to find our way for some years. And who can blame some folks if they say, can't we go back to the way it was 20, 30, 40 years ago? And I understand the feeling, but there's no going backward. There's only going forward. But we cannot change the nation right now, as difficult as it is, but we can decide who we are as a spiritual community. So there's the second lesson, to remember that we are in a wilderness and that that wilderness is non-negotiable. Now, there's a third lesson. We can learn by looking back, even if we can't go back. Memory is identity. We know who we are because of where we were. We remember things from childhood. We remember what we did before. Who would we be if we forgot all of that? Remembering is powerful. And our journey forward as a community through the wilderness is actually to look back along the path you've been. Knowing where you've been helps to remind you who you are who you have been. Even if that is a wilderness, you can see how you entered. Like individual people, spiritual communities have birth stories, sometimes birth traumas. We have growing pains and vivid moments that shaped our choices. Going forward sometimes requires backing up to regain clarity about where you've been so you can find out where you are. Winston Churchill once observed that the further back you can look, the further forward you are likely to see. Turning to the state of the nation again, and I can't ignore it because we live in troubled times. I read a social media post from a former parishioner, a Black man whose son and daughter came of age in my very white church. He reminded, that was, by the way, that was the same church that made the video. So he reminded people of the words of Professor Richard Wesley of that the Supreme Court has rarely been a friend to progress. So many of us are heartbroken that we've lost Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she was holding it all together for us. And I know the feeling. And Richard Wesley said, we forget that it was only a very brief period between 1954 and roughly 1974 that the Supreme Court actually was supporting a broader sense of human rights and dignity. It's actually been a bastion of conservatism most of its life, and we should not be surprised if it becomes that again. If we know our past and the struggles and the challenges of the past, we are strengthened to face the challenges of the future. Remembering is such an important and powerful part of who we are and what we're doing that I'm going to ask you to devote the next several months to gathering, hearing, sharing, not just the story and history of the church, but your stories of being part of this community, how you came to be in it. Yes, there is an official record, and I'm looking forward to reading Ann Schneider's collection of that story. But equally important are your stories of your experiences here, how you came to be here, what you find here, what you cherish, and what you wish. Those are the stories that turn it from history into life. In a very real sense, we are our stories. And the more we know them, the turns you took as a community, the previous times that you were in the wilderness, and you were, how you survived those times, where you arrived, how you prospered, even in times of difficulty. The more you know that, the more you can face the future and create it. So that's the first step in our journey. Those first 3 lessons are taking stock of your collective soul. Spiritual communities have souls, don't you know? A deep sense of who they are and what they intend to be. And it only turns up now and then. It only shows up in difficult times or in exciting times when, like that moment, I realized I had to walk across England, and you know exactly who you are, and you had to do that. This year will be about learning to listen, look, and be aware of when the soul of this organization is speaking and showing us who you are, where you are, and what you are. But there are more lessons. The 4th lesson I wish to share with you about my journey is to remember that it took someone else to show you you were on the right path. That's what I'm here to do, to say you're on the right path. I may not know what the path is, but I know you are where you belong and ought to be. That you're not lost at all, even if you are a little bewildered from time to time. That, yes, you will make wrong turns and you will backtrack from time to time. Because I know no more than you do about your path. All I know is that you're where you need to be and you're on the way to where you need to go. And I can tell you that with absolute confidence. It was another fine September day on that trip that I found myself entering a cow pasture. And the route always goes through cow pastures because that's the way English trails go. They go through pastures from one gate to another. And I had my guidebook and I was looking at it. And it was told me I had to cross the pasture, and there was a gate on the far side. I was on the right path, and right next to that other gate, right over there, were all the cows, all bunched up next to the gate. I was not about to try to move the cows. There was no way I was going to get them to move over so I could go through the gate. So I had to find another way to get there. If my mission was to get to the end of the wall, and my day's part of that mission was to get to the other side of the pasture, I had to change my path to get there. Thanks to a map, this is before cell phones and GPS, I could find a way around the pasture and reconnect with the path. That happened more than once on my walk, and so I came to expect it. The trick is finding your way back to the path you have to be on. So we have to know where we're going. And where we are going is not as certain for you as it was for me. There's no written guidebook to tell you what we're up to. But a business friend and fellow UU said to me, when you don't know where you're going, every road will take you there. So we have to make choices. Communities like ours in the wilderness can head down the wrong path if we don't remember where we're trying to go. If we end up going down memory lane, we're not going where we need to be. Or if we go off on some fantasy of being something we cannot be, or some idea of what we could have been, that's not the path. The task is always to ask, is this the path we should be following? And what I'm talking about is mission. You have a mission statement, you have a vision statement, and you're going to need to look at that and say, is this our mission again? Is it where we want to be, where we want to go right now? Maybe it is, but we have to make sure. For what end, to what end do you exist? As a Boy Scout, I learned orienteering, where you take a compass so you can find your way. Your mission and your vision are your compass. You have to look at them, see if they're pointing where you need to go. Because there is no map through the wilderness. Remember, it's a wilderness. And that's why the next step, once we have a deeper sense of how you got where you are, is to ask if you're aligned with your mission and vision. If so, that's great. Keep going. But if not, we will have to pause and look at the mission, which is the path, and the vision, which is the goal, and say, let's adjust that a little. And that we will do next spring, after we know clearly where we've been and where we are. That's why doing this is second and almost as important as the first. Unless your soul and your vision are aligned, you will struggle with questions about worship and education and social justice and staff and everything else. Some will say, well, we've always done it this way, so let's keep doing it that way. But is that the way of the future? I can't answer. You have to decide. And someone will say, well, our mission says we should do this, but maybe there are cows in the way, and we have to find a way around the cows. Yes, we are a herd of cats, as we often talk about ourselves. But the trick, my task, your task, is to find something so alluring, like milk or fish to a cat, that we would be glad to follow it and go after it. When we get to that place, which I'm hoping will be evident in about a year, if not a little sooner, you will know everything else you need to know. You will seek out not only an interim minister, but others to fill in the gaps, whether it's from the UUA or from the community. Members from your own church will arise into leadership who never knew they were called into leadership, because now they are compelled by the excitement of where you want to go. We should talk to our friends at Adobe Montessori and Nefesh Soul, because they see us through different eyes, and we should see how they see us. Valley Interfaith and Interfaith Power and Light all have wisdom to offer us as we chart our path into the future. As your sense of soul and vision and mission becomes firmer, you will begin to ponder the long-term questions that will affect your choice of a settled minister. Will you continue doing virtual services even after we get back together? Will your capital campaign change its vision? What sort of settled minister will it take to partner with as you approach those questions and others? Who in this community has the knowledge needed to guide that process. That's what leadership development is all about. And new leaders will emerge, as I said, and new forms of leadership. Being willing to embrace them all will be important. Knowing that you won't always get it right, but you will get some of it right, and you will be enriched. A Unitarian poet long ago, in response to the Mexican War, said, "New occasions teach new duties." We're going to discover new duties because there are new occasions before you and before us. And if that means some people move to the side who have been at the center, that's okay. Like the famous formation of the geese that fly in a V, so that the ones in the front are plowing the harder course and move back from time to time to let the fresh ones lead. That will be part of our journey. My last day along Hadrian's Wall was going to be tough because they said there were heavy rains coming. There was a section of road I knew I had to get across before the tide rose because it would cut me off from the rest. So I had to get up extra early in the morning, start trudging even before I would have liked. And I had to make shortcuts in the path that I was planning to make sure I got to the other side. Already each day I had walked through lots of mud and manure, so that every night I would rinse out my pants in the sink and scrub them with soap and hang them up to dry after I rinse and squish them out. And there I was crossing that flat road before the tide came in, and I made it, goodness. And the rain came for sure, and it drove at me from the Irish Sea, and I got soaked to the skin, and I discovered something. After 20 minutes, you can't get any wetter, and you can still walk, so keep walking. There's a lesson there. Just because it's hard doesn't mean you get to stop and dry out. I also was embarrassed because as I walked along and the rain was pelting at me, little balls of white fluff began to show up on my pants. All the soap I had not rinsed out were turning to suds. I was foaming at the pants. It was mortifying. But that didn't stop me either. We will be embarrassed. We will be soaked. We will be embarrassed sometimes. And we will get to the end. Now, the end of Hadrian's Wall, as I walked it, is a lean-to in the town of Bo'ness on Solway. And I stood there alone in the rain, taking a selfie or two, realizing I was done. It was not a very dramatic end. Your end will be far more dramatic. There will be a new minister, you will applaud, and then you will go home, as I did. And you will start the next day. But I was hooked. I knew I had to do it again. By all measures, when something is miserable and hard and lonely and still deeply satisfying, you have found your spiritual practice. That is my hope for your pilgrimage through the wilderness between settled ministers, that you will find it hard and confusing and painful and probably embarrassing, at least for me. But if we do it like we mean it, it will be beautiful and thrilling and memorable. And that's because we are a pilgrim church on an adventure of the Spirit, remember? A pilgrim church on an adventure of the Spirit. And it's time to get going. So let's be on our way. Amen.
Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet
If you would draw your candles and chalices near and join me in saying the words that we use to extinguish our chalice. Though we extinguish the chalice, our connection to each other and this community remains. May its light guide us this week as we walk the path of justice, speak words of love, and fill our world with compassion until we meet again.
Yom Kippur begins this evening, the holiest of days in the Jewish tradition. That made me think of Jonathan Sacks, Chief Rabbi of Great Britain, who gives a hint as to how that practice can inform us here. The single most important lesson of Yom Kippur, he says, is that it's never too late to change, to start again, to live differently from the way we've done in the past. Even if there's nothing we repent or regret, Yom Kippur makes us think about how to use the coming year in a way to bring blessings to the world and lives around us.